Lan Wangji said nothing, but Beechen's strikes grew more and more forceful, as though the sword was clashing with the mountains and the seas. The gravedigger hurriedly retreated, seemingly aware that with the corpse on his back, he was no match for Lan Wangji. If he continued fighting, he would inevitably be captured. Abruptly, he dug out a dark blue seal from around his waist. It was a teleportation talisman. This type of talisman could instantly send someone 1,000 kilometers away, but it would also consume a massive amount of spiritual energy, and the user would be forced to waste a great deal of time recovering. Without a sufficient quantity of spiritual power, they wouldn't be able to use the talisman at all. Thus, the teleportation talismans were invaluable objects. Very few people actually used them. Seeing that the gravedigger was about to flee, Wei Wuxian hurriedly clapped a couple of times, went down on one knee, and slammed his fist against the ground. The power of his strike penetrated many layers of soil, traveling straight into the depths of the earth. It bore through the thick lids of the Chang clan's coffins, stirring the dead trapped inside into a near frenzy. Several cracks sounded, and 4 blood-drenched arms rose from the ground, ferociously seizing the gravedigger's left and right legs. But the gravedigger seemed unconcerned. He directed his spiritual energy to his feet and blasted away the undead hands. Wei Wuxian pulled out his flute, and a sharp, mournful tune shredded through the descending curtain of night. 2 heads burst through the graveyard's earth, and the rest of their bodies soon followed. The corpses pulled themselves up the gravedigger's leg and wound themselves around his body like a pair of snakes. Opening their jaws, they prepared to bite down on his arms and neck. The gravedigger let out an irritated, disdainful groan, as though to say, amateurish. He sent his spiritual energy coursing through his entire body, but this time, after blasting away the corpses, he suddenly realized that he'd been tricked. He'd also sent the corpse on his back, flying. Wei Wuxian smacked the nearest tombstone, howling with laughter. Meanwhile, Lan Wangji stuck out a hand and caught the floppy, soft body. With his other hand, he raised Beechin and began another assault. The gravedigger realized that his freshly unearthed corpse had already been stolen, but he was unable to defeat Lan Wangji on his own, and on top of all of that, there was another person playing tricks on him. Thus, he dared not stay much longer. He flung the teleportation talisman at his feet, and after a loud boom, blue flames unfurled and flew skywards. His figure disappeared amidst the fire. Wei Wuxian knew from early on that the gravedigger was holding a teleportation talisman. Even if they caught him, he would have found the opportunity to escape. But seizing the corpse he had unearthed meant seizing a clue, so Wei Wuxian did not have regrets about the gravedigger's escape. He walked over to Lan Wangji and said, "Let's see who he dug up." A small spark of astonishment hit him as soon as he glanced at the body. Its skull had already been torn open, but no slush of blood and brain tissue leaked out. Instead, poking out of the hole were round balls of cotton, which had begun to blacken. Wei Wuxian pulled on the head, and it easily came off. "What's going on? Why is there a fake corpse made of rags and cotton?" he asked, holding up the exquisitely made false head. Having held the body and felt its weight in his hand, Lan Wangji already knew that something was strange. "It's not entirely fake," he said. Wei Wuxian groped around the corpse for a bit and discovered that all of its 4 limbs were squishy. Only its chest and abdomen were stiff and felt like they belonged to a real corpse. After ripping off its clothes, he discovered that, indeed, the torso was a real torso, but otherwise, the remaining parts of the body were fake. The cotton limbs and head had been used to trick the torso into thinking its other parts were still attached. Based on the appearance of the torso skin and the severed flesh on its left shoulder, where its arm would have been, it could only belong to their good friend. The gravedigger had indeed come to dig him up. Wei-Wuxian rose. It seems whoever's been hiding the corpse parts already noticed that we're investigating the situation. He came to move the torso because he was afraid we'd uncover it. Arriving early isn't nearly as good as arriving at just the right time, eh? He ran into us at precisely the wrong moment. But the tone of his voice changed. How come the fog-faced gravedigger was so familiar with your clan's fighting style? Obviously, Lan Wangji was contemplating this question too. The layer of frost covering his face had yet to retreat. His cultivation level is pretty high enough to support his use of the teleportation talisman, Wei-Wuxian continued. He also cast a spell on his face and sword. It's easy to understand why he'd do it to his face. He was afraid someone would recognize him, of course. But usually, no-name cultivators don't need to use magic to mask their swords. Unless his sword is at least a little famous, or maybe even very famous. If a lot of people are familiar with the light of his blade, then brandishing it would immediately unmask him. He'd have no choice but to cover it up. Han Guangjun, you fought him a moment ago. Do you think he's someone you're familiar with? Wei-Wuxian probed. Because of the matter's delicacy, he couldn't speak more precisely than that. For example, he couldn't ask if the gravedigger could be Lan Xichen or Lan Qiren. No, Lan Wangji answered confidently. Wei-Wuxian had a great deal of faith in Lan Wangji's reply. He didn't think that Lan Wangji was the type of person who would hide from or refuse to face the truth. If he said the gravedigger wasn't someone close to him, then that was the end of the story, and he also disliked lying. The way Wei-Wuxian saw it, Lan Wangji would rather cast a silencing spell on himself than speak a deliberate falsehood. Thus, Wei-Wuxian immediately ruled out the two people he had been thinking of previously. This makes things even more complicated, he said. Lan Wangji placed the torso inside another two-layered, evil-sealing Qianken pouch and tucked it away carefully. He and Wei-Wuxian circled around the area a few times, then leisurely made their way back to the liquor street. The waiter had indeed been true to his word. A great majority of the liquor stores lining the street had already closed, but the store sign was still up, and the lights were still glowing. The man himself was outside, shoveling food into his mouth from a massive, ocean-sized bowl. "You're back," he said delightedly upon seeing them. "What do you think? We're an establishment that keeps our word, right? Did you two see anything?" Laughing, Wei-Wuxian said a few words in reply. Then he and Lan Wangji sat down at the same table they had occupied during the day. Jars of alcohol were piled from Wei-Wuxian's feet all the way up to the table. "All right, where were we earlier?" The sudden appearance of that gravedigger interrupted us. "I still don't know how Changping died." Lan Wangji continued telling the story in his extremely succinct, flat, and unadorned style. Xue Yang, Xiao Xingchen, Song Lan, and other figures in the story continued exiting the stage. Those who had vanished, vanished, and those who had died, died. One day, several years after the events surrounding the Chang clan's massacre, the surviving members were murdered in a single night. Their bodies sliced to pieces through death by 1,000 cuts, and on top of that, Changping's eyes had been dug straight out from his head. Who the culprit was this time, no one managed to discover. After all, everyone involved in the original sequence of events had all died or vanished. However, there was one thing they could verify. The sword that had been used to inflict the death by 1,000 cuts, as confirmed by the wounds, was none other than Xiao Xingchen's own sword, Shuanghua. Wei-Wuxian froze, just as the bowl of liquor he was holding reached his lips, stunned by this information. The death by 1,000 cuts was inflicted by Shao Xingchen's sword. Does that mean he was the culprit? All signs of Shao Xingchen have disappeared. It is impossible to reach a verdict, Lan Wangji said. Since no one's been able to find him alive, has anyone tried summoning his soul? Yes. No result. No result? That meant he either wasn't dead or the pieces of his soul had been scattered to the winds. As a specialist in the area, Wei Wuxian had to give his opinion on the matter. You can't talk about things like summoning souls in an absolute manner. Nothing can be dispensed with, not the place, the time, the person, or the skies. Everything has to be in perfect harmony, and even then, sometimes a mistake will still happen. I guess a lot of people believe that the murder of the remaining chunks were also Shao Xingchen's revenge, right? Hong Guangjun, what about you? What do you think? Lan Wangji slowly shook his head. Without the complete picture, I cannot comment. Wei Wuxian deeply admired his friend's attitude, his principles, and his way of handling affairs. Beaming, he drank another mouthful of liquor. He heard Lan Wangji speak again. What is your opinion? The death by 1,000 cuts is a type of torture, Wei Wuxian replied. It signifies punishment. In any case, digging out Chang Ping's eyes made the association with Shao Xingchen unavoidable, since his eyes were dug out the same way. So the speculation that it was Shao Xingchen's revenge is understandable. However, he took a second to think about how to word things. In my opinion, Shao Xingchen hadn't gotten involved in order to win Chang Ping's gratitude. So He had yet to think through exactly what he would say following the eye, when the waiter very hospitably sent over 2 small platters of peanuts. The interruption just so happened to spare him from continuing his previous thought. Lifting his eyes and looking at Lan Wangji, he smiled and said, Hong Guangjun, why are you looking at me like that? I don't have much of an opinion. I also don't know the whole story, so I can't comment, just like you. What you said was very true. Until we understand the whole sequence of events and know every relevant piece of information, we shouldn't be jumping to hasty conclusions. I only asked for 5 jars, but you bought me an extra 5 on top of that. I'm afraid I won't be able to finish them myself. How about it? Drink with me? This isn't the cloud recesses, after all, so you won't be violating the ban on alcohol, right? Wei Wuxian was already prepared to hear his offer flatly rejected, and had no idea that Lan Wangji would reply, yes. Han Guangjun, you've really changed, Wei Wuxian said, clicking his tongue. I once drank a small jar in front of you, and you were so furious you threw me over the wall. You also hit me. But now, you've even started hiding jars of Emperor's Smile in your room and drinking in secret. Lan Wangji fixed the front of his robes. I have never touched a single jar of Emperor's Smile, he said quietly. Why hide it if you aren't drinking it? What, you kept them to give to me? All right, all right. If you haven't touched it, you haven't touched it. I'm not allowed to believe you. I won't bring it up again. Come on, I have to see the exact number of cups it takes to get a teetotaling disciple of the Gusulan clan falling down drunk. He poured a bowl for his friend. Without even thinking about it, Lan Wangji took it and downed the whole thing. Wei Wuxian felt an indescribable excitement and scrutinized his face to see when it would start turning red. To his surprise, he didn't see even the tiniest change in color. Even after a long period of observation, Lan Wangji's pale irises gazed calmly and attentively back at Wei Wuxian. Not a single thing about him had changed. Greatly disappointed, Wei Wuxian was just about to coax his friend into drinking another jar, when suddenly, Lan Wangji frowned and lightly rubbed the space between his eyebrows. After a moment, he lay his forehead on his hand and closed his eyes. He fell asleep. He fell asleep. After most people drank so much alcohol, they became drunk first, then fell asleep. Why had Lan Wangji skipped over the drunk phase entirely and gone straight to sleeping? The drunk phase was what Wei Wuxian wanted to see. He waved his hand in front of the solemn and upstanding even when sleeping face of Lan Wangji, then clapped his hands a few times next to his friend's ears. There was no response. Shockingly, Lan Wangji was an incredible lightweight, the kind that was knocked out by a single blow. Wei Wuxian had no idea that this would happen. He slapped his leg, thought for a moment, then curled Lan Wangji's right arm around his neck and fitfully hauled him away from the store. Having long since become adept at snatching things off Lan Wangji's person, Wei Wuxian pulled out his friend's wallet, found an inn, and rented 2 rooms. He brought him inside one of the rooms, removed his boots, and tucked him in. Then he took advantage of the dark night to slip out. Wei Wuxian strolled to a desolate, secluded area outside of town. When he arrived, he pulled out the bamboo flute at his waist, placed it on his lips, and played a tune. Then he waited in silence. He and Lan Wangji had spent each and every day side by side recently, and Wei Wuxian had had no time to himself. Thus, he had been bereft of opportunities to summon Wen Ning. He had avoided doing so in his friend's presence, partly because of his earlier desire to conceal his identity, but there was another reason, too. Wen Ning had the blood of the Gusu Lan clan disciples on his hands. No matter how well Lan Wangji treated Wei Wuxian, he couldn't summon Wen Ning in front of him. Or rather, it was because Lan Wangji had treated him so well that Wei Wuxian wasn't shameless enough as to summon Wen Ning in front of his face. No matter how impervious he was to shame generally, it didn't extend to this type of situation. By the time he left his reverie, deep clinks and clangs were already echoing in his ears. Head lowered, Wen Ning's silhouette appeared beneath the shadow of the town walls. He was dressed from head to toe in lacquer black, dissolving into the darkness around him, except his pupilless eyes, which were a painful, blinding white, malevolent white. Wei Wuxian placed his hands behind his back and slowly circled around Wen Ning. The fierce corpse shifted, as though he wanted to turn and follow Wei Wuxian's movements. "Stand still," Wei Wuxian said. Thus, Wen Ning stood still and motionless. His delicate, pretty features seemed to grow dejected. "Hand," Wei Wuxian said. The fierce corpse held out his right hand. Wei Wuxian grabbed his wrist and lifted it, then carefully examined the iron cuff encircling his arm and the iron chains which dangled below it. These were anything but ordinary chains. A frenzied Wen Ning was extremely powerful and violent, and could wring steel into slush with his bare hands. He would never have allowed the fetters to remain on his body like this. Unfortunately, the chains had most likely been specifically created to shackle Wen Ning. Crush his bones and scatter his ashes. Some clans had even attempted to restore the Yin Tiger Tally, as destructive an instrument as it was. So of course they'd also drool over the prospect of having the Ghost General in their possession. How could they have been willing to crush his bones and scatter his ashes? Wei Wuxian let out a cold laugh. Standing to Wen Ning's side, he thought for a bit, then stuck his hand into the Ghost General's hair and slowly began pressing at his scalp. The people who had locked Wen Ning up and kept him around certainly couldn't have let him act in accordance with his own free will. In order to make him obey others' orders, they had to destroy his consciousness, so they must have done something to his head. As expected, on the third press, Wei Wuxian felt something small and hard on the right side of Wen Ning's skull, right on one of his energy points. He placed his other hand on the corresponding point on the left side of Wen Ning's head, and indeed, he found another small and hard object. They felt like the tail ends of a pair of needles. Pinching both needle ends at the same time, Wei Wuxian slowly pulled 2 long, black nails from the inside of Wen Ning's skull. The 2 nails were about the length of a thumb, the thickness of the red ropes used in jade pendants, and had been buried deep inside Wen Ning's head. The moment the nails left his skull, Wen Ning's features began to tremble, and a layer of black, blood vessel-like threads began to creep out over his white eyes. He appeared to be in agony. Though Wen Ning was undoubtedly dead, he could very much still feel suffering and similar things. Fine and intricate patterns were carved onto the 2 nails, which were clearly of extraordinary origin. The person who made them was certainly no mean talent. Wei Wuxian would have to wait quite a while for Wen Ning's recovery. He tucked the nails away, lowered his head, and looked at the chains around the fierce corpse's wrists and ankles. It would be no good for Wen Ning to continue dragging the noisy shackles around, he thought. He would have to find a cultivator's sword and chop them off. Naturally, the first thing he thought of was Lan Wangji's beacon. Even though it was a bit inappropriate to use the sword of someone from the Lan clan to help Wen Ning remove his chains, it was the easiest sword for him to get a hold of. Plus, it wasn't like he could just let Wen Ning drag such cumbersome things around. How about this? Wei Wuxian thought to himself. I'll go back to the inn now. If Lan Chan's awake, when I get there, I won't touch Beechin. If Lan Chan's still sleeping, then I'll borrow Beechin to use for a bit. Having made his decision, he turned around. Who could have guessed he would find Lan Wangji standing right behind him?